Welcome to For the Church, a podcast for the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion Church exists to join Jesus in his mission to reach people with the gospel and then to equip his people to worship and serve. I'm your host, Keaton Paul, and joining me is my conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. Well, we had a big week last week in particular, and last week was the denomination that we're a part of at Zion Presbyterian Church, the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America. Our General Assembly happened. It was the 51st General Assembly. And so in this episode, we want to sit down and talk about, one, the PCA in particular, and then talk about some of the rulings and how we're set up and what are maybe some directional movements that the denomination is taking a part of and moving towards. But before we do that, hey Seth, it's been a long time.
It's been so long. It feels so good to be back doing this.
It does.
We've been trying to find a time to get back in the swing of things, and we've been all over the place and traveling and life. So it feels really good to be back doing this. I'm excited to talk about GA.
Yeah.
Because I don't really understand GA.
But a lot of the people at GA also don't understand GA.
And so any clarity that we could possibly bring to the conversation around what this is and what's happening would be more than helpful.
Absolutely. You know, like this is a good space, you know, because you can't take a sermon or even, I mean, maybe we could do it. I have toyed around with the idea of like the history of the PCA as a Sunday school class. Mm-hmm. Maybe in the future we could do something like that or somewhere else. I don't know. It's a really cool history. I love the PCA's heritage by and large. I mean, we obviously have, you know, some not so great things that we repented of, and probably more things that we'll have to repent of because we're sinners. But in all, I love the PCA. I think it's obviously the best denomination because
it's the one you're a part of.
It's the one I'm a part of. That's not why it's the best, but that's why I'm a part of it. It's because I think, there we go. But okay, so with that though, you know, especially in and amongst our own ranks, we have a lot of people who find themselves at Zion. And I would venture to say this would be a fun, kind of statistic for somebody to do, not me, but to sit down and like through our roles, who are people who are actually from a Presbyterian background. Yeah. And
well, considering that there are 2 Presbyterian churches in Columbia and only 1 PCA church, is that right? A few Cumberland Presbyterians, sorry.
There are a lot of Cumberland Presbyterians.
Yeah, but it's not, I mean, we are far outweighed by the more Baptist structure.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up is because, specifically Baptist, is because that they're basically on the spectrum almost the direct opposite of what a Presbyterian structure is. And so just in terms of autonomy and versus the kind of elder structure that we have.
Right.
So go ahead and break that down for me.
Yeah.
How the Presbyterian structure is built.
Yes. So here's a one. This is always an interesting thing to bring up with people. When we say we're Presbyterian, a lot of people in our kind of world, they hear Presbyterian, and if, you know, whatever, they hear that and automatically, first thing off the bat, what do they think? They think Reformed, which is great. That's a good thing to think of. It's not always true. Presbyterian, though, the very term is actually not so much about our theology as much as it is about our polity. So our
polity being
our church polity, our structure, like how the church is structured. So there, you know, we talked about this before, in I think season 3 on What is a Pastor, on the various ways that you can structure a church, right? So there are like 3-ish ways. There are subcategories here, but three typical ways to structure a church. There's what's known as an episcopacy, or it's a more hierarchical top-down sort of approach to church governance, how the church is overseen. Each church has a pastor or a vicar, a region of pastors have a bishop that oversee them, and over all the bishops is an archbishop, right? You see this in the Anglican Church, in the Greek Orthodox Church, to a certain degree in the Roman Catholic Church, and other places. On the opposite end of that spectrum is the structure that a lot of Baptists or non-denominational, quote unquote, groups have, where each church has its own autonomy, right? So every church is just kind of on its own. No church is really accountable to any other church, right? They might get together in some sort of fellowship. We'll talk about the SBC's convention, obviously, because we want to stir the pot here. We are all for, as the kids say, spilling the tea, which like, if you're spilling, quote unquote, spilling the tea and talking about church polity, like, you're a different kind of nerdy. So if you're still listening at this point, welcome to the club. You're like really nerdy.
You have no choice at this point.
That's right. But anyway, so each one it's like their own thing, right? The SBC is an example of this. Presbyterian is this happy middle position, which is the biblical option, I like to say. Not like, okay, yeah, so I had to do that hot take, throw that in there. I do think Presbyterian polity is biblical. So like, because I'm Presbyterian, that's why I think it, but I think there's good biblical reason why. Okay, so the way Presbyterianism works, it's a system of governance. I think it's biblical, that focuses in on mutual accountability at every step of the way. Okay. And one thing that I'll describe Presbyterian polity. One thing that you may notice if you paid attention in U.S. history is that a lot of Presbyterian polity, the way it gets described, it actually sounds strangely a whole lot like the way that the U.S. government is structured. Hopefully we operate in more efficient manners, but it sounds a lot, and there are things like checks and balances. Oh, that sounds interesting. And actually part of the reason why is it's not that, Presbyterians modeled their polity after the U.S. government, but actually the U.S. government modeled their polity after Presbyterians, which is, beautiful and wonderful and good for you. Why has it worked this long as well as it has? Because it's been based on Presbyterianism. So anyway, all right, that's enough of me trying to hype this up. So here's our denominational structure. There are really three courts, we could say, three courts of the church in a Presbyterian model. The local court for an individual church is what's known as the session. The session is a group of elders who oversee and shepherd the church, right? So at a sessional level, they're the ones who are overseeing the church, who are shepherding the flock, who are ensuring that the sacraments are administered correctly, who are admitting members to the flock, who are having to, at times, execute church discipline, both in a positive way and in negative ways, right? Like, so, church discipline is not just you're excommunicated, but like overseeing Sunday school curriculum is an exercise of church discipline, right? So there's a positive way, we're catechizing our kids, and that's a form of church discipline. It's a proactive form, and it's a great form. So anyway, that's the local level. That's kind of sphere one, the session, a group of, in our group, denomination, teaching elders and ruling elders, with little stars beside each one, making up this local court called the session. There's a regional court, though, called a presbytery. A presbytery is a regional court where teaching elders and some ruling elders gather together representing their various churches within a region. And so at the presbytery level, it's a higher court, right? So that doesn't denigrate the local court of the session, it actually it provides accountability. One professor told me that the beauty of Presbyterian polity, specifically with the presbytery, is because each church is accountable to all the other churches in a region. It protects good pastors from bad churches and good churches from bad pastors, right? So in a world that unfortunately is has an unfortunate number of spiritual abuse and pastoral abuse that occurs in many denominations, quote unquote, there's nothing anybody can really do at the end of the day. The beauty with Presbyterian polity, though, is the minute that something happens, spiritual abuse, a pastor goes rogue and begins teaching, heretical views like on the doctrine of the Trinity, you write to the session. And like, this is something that, we welcome as pastors, right? This is good for us. If we step out of line and become heretics, write to the presbytery, like bring us up on charges. Because those guys care for our souls and don't want to see us go astray, and they don't want to see the church go astray. And so you can appeal to that court, and then we can, be brought on charges, and whatever happens. So it's a higher court in this regional setting, where all the pastors and churches are accountable to each other. And then finally, at the national level, is the General Assembly. So local typically meets more regularly, typically like at least once a month. Our session meets about twice a month. The regional court, the presbytery, normally gathers and meets quarterly. And at the General Assembly, we gather annually. So those are the three different courts. They kind of work their way up. They're all mutually accountable. And it means that, a pastor at a very small church in, Podunk Nowhere, Flowood, Mississippi, right? And Seth laughs because he knows where Flowood is, as do I. We've both been there. Anyway, that guy at that church, at the national level, has every bit as much of a voice as the pastor at First Presbyterian Church Jackson, which is huge, or as much authority as the pastor at Christ Pres in Brentwood, which is another huge and influential church, et cetera, et cetera. So because of that, every pastor gets the same voice. Everybody gets heard. There is no single authority. There's constant mutual accountability and constant checks and balances, which I think is biblical. I think there are good exegetical reasons for that. So those are the three different kind of levels of our structure. Now then, within that, to be a part of the PCA, our denomination, right? The Presbyterian polity we've already laid out, but there are certain governing documents. To be a part of this, you have to ascribe to certain things. Our first, chief, highest authoritative source governing document is the Bible itself, right? That's our ultimate authority. It cannot be changed. It does not matter who you are, where you're from, what kind of votes you get. The Bible can't be changed. It's the norm that norms all norm. That's just a good Reformation principle of sola scriptura, right? It's the norming norm. Okay. We can take all that, right? From there, a second tiered, so not the Bible, below the Bible, one thing that we take vows on as pastors in particular, we don't have members take vows if they ascribe to these or not. It's good if they do. It makes sense if they are at least somewhere in the realm that they're going to our church. But pastors have to ascribe to the second tier level of authority, are creeds and confessions. Okay, so the ecumenical creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, we have to uphold and affirm, which, pretty much everybody, if you call yourself an Orthodox Christian, a Bible-believing Christian, you should be able to come to the Nicene Creed and say, yep, believe that, affirm that. But then we also take vows to uphold the Westminster Standards. the Westminster Confession of Faith, and its larger and shorter catechisms. Those are second-tier authoritative sources. Unlike the Bible, the Westminster Standards can be changed.
And have been.
Right. So particularly in America, we've changed certain chapters on the kind of the role of the church and state, on kind of the nature of the conscience, and have made things like that. We can do that today if we wanted to at this past General Assembly. We didn't, but if we wanted to, or at the next one, we could. It requires a 3/4 vote, which is a pretty high margin, right? So if we're going to vote on something like that to change the Westminster Standards, it takes a hefty vote. And so it's possible. It's not very likely, but it's a second-tier authoritative source. So one of a third-tier authoritative source that we still take vows on, at least sections of, is really what we talked about before in Finding a Pastor, Season 3. Go look it up. Is what we call the Book of Church Order, or the BCO. And basically what the Book of Church Order is a playbook, okay? So the Bible, it's non-negotiable. The Westminster Standards these are basically our core principles, right? This is what we believe, generally speaking. You can take certain exceptions to it, and it's fine. Some guys do, some guys don't. But like, it's more of like, this is how we read the Bible, generally speaking. The Book of Church Order is really the agreed upon playbook. Okay, so it's not so much about convictions or theology. That would be our Westminster Standards. There are certain aspects where there's bleed over, but more or less it's saying this is the rules that we're going to play by, are the rules that we're going to play by. So that's kind of our threefold tiered structure, right? The Bible, the Westminster Standards, the Book of Church Order. Okay, so now then, before we jump right into how GA went, there are some helpful terms to know if you're trying to read, articles by our denominational magazine, by Faith Magazine. It's good. You can look it up. It's online for free now.
We'll put a link in the show notes, and I will say I think that's probably the best source to go to if you're trying to understand what's going on.
Yes.
There's some other sources that are helpful as far as cultural context.
Yeah.
But as far as like by the book, here's play-by-play of what happened.
That's right.
By Faith has all of that in a very, I'm going to just say it,
Go
dry and boring kind of way.
Amen.
It'll list everything that happened.
In Presbyterian terms, we like to say decently and in order, but boring and dry is fine too.
But as far as like what goes down at GA, what went down, what happened, without any sort of commentary.
Yes.
By Faith has all of that.
Yeah.
Just like here's the order of business.
Yeah. It's good reporting. So, and also they record all the sessions. If we were to meet, here's your first term, executive session. Executive session means that the only people in the room, it's private in executive session. The only people in the room are those who are delegates and able to vote. More often than not, I don't think I've been in a GA. They probably have been. I've only been to 2, so I'm a newbie. But more often than not, you're not in executive session. And so it's a public meeting, right? So last year we met in Memphis. Destiny came with me, and she sat in those meetings as long as she wanted to, right? Which is, for most people, not very long. But okay, so that's executive session. But if you want to go listen to it, you'll hear a lot of things start whenever guys come up to the mic for debate. They'll probably say something like, step up to the mic, T.E. Keaton Paul, Nashville Presbyterian, right? That's how you start to identify yourself as who you are. You'll hear 2 letters at the beginning, T.E. or R.E. A T.E. is a teaching elder. Jeff and I are teaching elders, right? So we're ordained in the PCA to preach and administer the sacraments. Good. An RE is a ruling elder. Your ruling elders are typically not guys who have gone through seminary. They've been ordained to the office of eldership, but they're not ordained to themselves typically preach and administer the sacraments. They're there to shepherd. So it's the same office, it's a different function. It's kind of a unique aspect of who we are as the PCA and the Southern Presbyterian tradition, and I would love to talk about that, but we don't have time. So TD and RE, teaching elder, ruling elder. Good. Commissioner. If you read By Faith and you're reading it, and it'll talk about the commissioners. The commissioners are those teaching elders and ruling elders at General Assembly who are registered to vote, right? Every teaching elder in the PCA can be a registered commissioner every single year. Ruling elders, churches are able to send, I believe, 2 per church. So a ruling elder, and you have to designate who those are. They show up, but not every ruling elder is necessarily a commissioner at GA. We didn't have any ruling elders as commissioners this year. We have before. I was the only commissioner this year at GA because Jeff had things to do, so he couldn't make it. So I was a commissioner. Anybody that's there voting, those are commissioners. Okay.
So to be clear, if you were to take Jim Davis with you, he could be a commissioner.
He could be a commissioner.
If I, for whatever reason, were to go, because I'm not a ruling elder,
right?
I could go.
You could
be a part of these meetings, but I would not be a commissioner.
You wouldn't be a commissioner. Cool. You couldn't vote.
There we go.
So that's a commissioner. An overture. You'll hear all kinds of things about the overtures. An overture 30 whatever. Okay, an overture is basically a proposition given to the General Assembly. A lot of the times it's worked its way through the presbyteries. It's come to GA. Now we're going to vote on this piece of legislation or this course of action. And sometimes it can be a change to our BCO, our Book of Church Order. If we make a change to the Book of Church Order, it requires a 2/3 vote. Or it could be, we're going to, we're in this overture, we are saying we're going to put together a committee to write a report on theonomy or paedo communion or the influence of social media on our children, right? That would just take a simple majority vote. But overtures are, here's this proposition that requires action that we as commissioners are going to vote on.
And presumably some sort of action that would change the course of the PCA.
That's right.
Either major or minor.
That's right. Okay. And most of them are actually pretty minor.
Yeah,
right?
I would assume.
Yeah, most of them are, this group is going to write a report. It's not really going to change your day-to-day, but it'll give us a thing to say, okay, a group of our peers gathered together, and this is the general stance of the PCA. Okay. Minority report. Oftentimes, so there's an overture committee who sift through, perfect the wording, work through some various things of what is presented to GA, right? Things that need to get addressed. Oftentimes in the overture committee, if it's a hot button topic, and the committee themselves are split, and it's a pretty close split, you'll have the majority present the overture itself, and then the group that is in disagreement with that overture on that overture committee will write a minority report. There are fewer on the overture committees who believe what's before you. Here is what they say, and you can vote either for what the majority took, or you can put the minority report as the main report, and then vote on it, and it goes through. Committee and commission. So we talked about a commissioner, somebody that votes regularly in both the presbytery, at all 3 tiers, the session, the presbytery, and General Assembly can have a committee or a commission do something. Committees in the PCA are a group of people, of peers. So let's say we, as Zion, decide, we're going to have a pastoral search committee. We're going to vote on that as a congregation. So the congregation is going to get together. These are the people that we think would make up a good committee for our pastoral search committee. They represent us well. They're going to do the hard work of sifting through applications, yada, 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 and then present to us and say, here is what we think we need and who we think we need. And then we as a congregation vote on that person. A committee is not able to vote, like to delegate themselves autonomously, right? They're reporting to the full body. So you can have a committee at General Assembly, a select group of pastors who get together, who talk about something, who whatever, write a report and say, here's what we think. We're not able to make a unilateral decision here, but we think we make up a good slice of the denomination. Here's what we think. You can vote it up or down. A commission is a group that you're actually giving permission to vote on your behalf, right? So commissioners vote. A commission, right? If we did a pastoral search commission, for instance, we would be telling a select group of people, you have the right to vote amongst yourselves as representatives of us on who our next pastor is. That doesn't happen. That's not a thing, but that's just an example of the difference between a pastoral search committee and a pastoral search commission.
So a committee is almost like a representative delegate. You know, we can't gather all 300 people who attend Zion, or however many pastors there are in the PCA.
Right.
We can't gather all of them. So we're going to get a few of them that are good cross section.
Yes.
And have them do it. A commission would be, you guys are now decision makers.
That's
Go.
right.
Okay.
That's right. Yep. So that's the difference.
So now that we've kind of covered all that.
Yes.
And I hope that you're still hanging with us.
Yes.
Because now we're getting to the meaty stuff of like this year. So
that's right.
GA gathered in Richmond,
Virginia. Yeah, that's right.
What kind of, so there are a few things that I've seen personally and like my personal news consumption.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that it would be better to just kind of come from you, like lay out kind of what happened, and then we can kind of talk about it.
Yes. So first and foremost, let's talk about general health of the PCA. Okay. By and large, there were things that happened at GA that I think most people would be like, this is kind of strange. There were a lot of pretty close votes on things, which, means that there are certain divides within the PCA, let's say. That being said, that's something that the PCA has, since its inception, has valued as being a big tent denomination. The standard kind of authoritative history of the PCA is a book by Dr. Sean Michael Lucas, professor of church history at RTS, called For a Continuing Church. And basically in that book, he argues that when the mainline Presbyterian denomination went liberal, the inception of the PCA was to found a new conservative mainline Presbyterian denomination, right? So the PCA is not a fundamentalist, schismatic group historically. We're a big tent mainline denomination. That does not mean liberal, right? And the reason why they moved that way, because they were like, the mainline denomination, the PCUS, then the PCUSA, they've gone apostate. They're not a real denomination anymore. They're not a Christian church. And so that's the move. When you have a big tent denomination, one thing you have to just be okay with are certain tensions. And I think, personally, why I'm a part of the PCA, I think that's beautiful. I love the fact that we're a denomination that's able to have a certain broadness to say, on that thing, we can actually agree to disagree. And that's okay.
Do you feel, because one of the things that's kind of happening with other conservative evangelical denominations is a fight, not a fight, but like that tension, right? That also exists in other denominations.
Yeah.
Is the push and pull is slowly becoming more, no, we should be a fundamentalist, schismatic group.
Yeah.
did you feel any of that trying to enter
Mm-hmm.
the room a little bit at
Yeah,
all? And that's not saying
yeah,
yes, no. Like I'm curious.
yeah. I do think there actually is some of that, which is it's unfortunate. I think it's a little bit of part of our culture of, there can't be nuance in a lot of ways, and like, you know, I've I've gotten to be a part of, a broad range of the PCA, which in the grand scheme of things is not very broad, right? Let me just go on record here and say this. One, um, the most theologically liberal person in the PCA, in the grand scheme of things, in the global church, is massively theologically conservative,
Mm-hmm.
is a right-wing conservative theologically, right? So just hear that, right? Okay. And I don't know, like everybody in the PCA, I know a lot of people in the PCA. The most liberal person in the grand scheme of things is very, very conservative. Okay. There are also a lot of people that I know that I vote on theologically at GA. Overtures, we vote on different sides of the aisle. Again, it's a very small aisle in the grand scheme of things. I don't know a single guy in the PCA that I'm like, that dude is not a good dude, right? That guy is not a faithful pastor, and that guy doesn't love Jesus. I don't know a single pastor in the PCA that doesn't love Jesus and love the Bible and preach the Bible and teach the Bible the best they know how. Okay, so let me just say that. But the fact that there does seem to be a little bit of a tension of, if we deviate in any way on, sometimes really important things, sometimes maybe not so important things, as we'll look at here in a minute, then can we even be together? And I think a part of that is just the culture that we live in. Unfortunately, a lot of the global political mindset today has crept its way into the church. That's an unfortunate thing. But a lot of, for lack of a better term, ideological, we could say, extremism has really crept its way in. And so there are certain things that are second tier issues that are given first tier intensity. And the us versus them thing is so easy to get caught up in. And, and sometimes I even find myself, looking at like, oh gosh, these guys again, oh my gosh. And then, and then I'll be thinking about it, and I'll bump into, a buddy from seminary, and I'll realize, oh, he's one of those guys.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a dude that, like, that guy would take a bat for me. Mm-hmm. We don't agree on this thing at all, but that's my brother. And like, he would totally. And so, that changes the dynamic of the us versus them sort of thing, to know, yeah, like, we don't agree on this, but we're brothers in the trenches. And I want to see that get recaptured, because I do think that that's the general ethos of the PCA historically. So there was that weird tension there. A lot of, not too many things, honestly, but a few different things that were somewhat split down the aisle, that I think had strange kind of political echoes and ties to it, that just, that felt a little bit more closed fist than they really should have. So that was the weird vibe. I will say this though, this was cited constantly on the general health of the PCA. A statistic cited from a recent book called The Great De-Churching by Jim Davis, not our Jim Davis, but Jim Davis, Michael Graham, and Ryan Burge, that if you took all of the estimated number of conversions from the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and all the Billy Graham crusades, and combined them together, that is how many people have left the church in the past 20 years. So, the First Great Awakening, which lasted a pretty good while, the Second Great Awakening lasted a pretty good while, and, Billy Graham crusades went forever. He lived to be a very old man. that long span of time, really 3 centuries, right? The bulk, and again, scholars on the Great Awakenings, etc., will debate the start and the finish. But you take those massive numbers, that's the number of people who have left in like the past 20 to 25 years. And then the next statistic from there is to say, with that in the Great Dechurching, every denomination is quickly, or at least to some degree, quickly or slowly dying, right? We've seen it in the PCA USA for, decades now, the slow decline of liberal churches. Now the average, person in a PC USA church is older. They're not planting any churches. They're slowly dying off. The SBC, in the past 10 years, its numbers are like half of what they were at the high water mark in like 2010 or something like that. There's a footnote in that statistic. All denominations are dwindling either, quickly or, pretty consistently. And then there's a little footnote that says there is one exception. One denomination is actually continuing to grow at a steady pace, and that's the PCA.
That's great.
Yeah.
I have a lot of all of the thoughts that I have are like a whole episode in and of themselves.
Yeah.
I will say Christianity Today has done some really great reporting, and have had Ryan Burge on several times to kind of talk about all of this. I highly recommend listening to those, because it's Christian voices talking to him about this. It's really wonderful.
Yeah.
All that to say, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
That the PCA is growing, and obviously I'm a little bit biased.
Yeah.
But I'm not, for many, many reasons, not the least of which is the dedication to biblical truth. I'm not surprised that the PCA is growing.
Yeah. Yeah. And we, from the inception until now, really our motto, we have 3 things, right? The PCA, this was the theme this year, was focusing specifically on the preaching this year. Our 3 things as a denomination: we believe in the authority of the Bible. We're committed to the Reformed faith and committed to keeping the Great Commission. Like, that is the PCA. We believe the Bible. We hold to the Westminster Standards, and we want to take the gospel to the far reaches of the globe. And so it's a really special place. And I think by and large, we really, no matter, even with some of the weird tension and splits, 52, 48% votes on certain things. Even with that, everybody in that room, again, that I know, and I know a pretty broad span within the PCA, which again, not a very big span, but they're all wholeheartedly committed to those 3 things: the authority of the Bible, the Reformed faith, and the Great Commission. And so that's really healthy. And I will say this, we did end up, deliberating on certain things that I kind of paused and was like, why are we talking about this? But also in the grand scheme of things, keeping things in perspective, I think there's a lot of health in the PCA. One, in the fact that we all are committed to that thing of the authority of the Bible, the Reformed faith, and keeping the Great Commission. We're growing. We're actively planting churches. We're leading so many charges in so many different ways. And we talked about this before. I wasn't sure if I was going to bring this up or not. The Southern Baptist Convention has been, for the 2 of us, you more so than me, has been a great place for us, right? I wasn't really raised in the Southern Baptist tradition. I attended a Southern Baptist church in college, and I interned at a Southern Baptist church at the end of seminary. I will say, Southern Baptist pastors have taught me so much, especially about preaching, I've learned so much about preaching from Southern Baptist pastors who have been really charitable and generous to me to pull me under their wing and, here's some good tips and pointers for preaching. Been super duper helpful. You were raised Southern Baptist.
Yeah.
Like running through your veins. And so hear this when we say there are so many in the Southern Baptist Convention that we love, and the Lord has used it in incredible ways as a denomination or fellowship convention. I want to get that right. I think if we pause though to say, just kind of holding up the two conventions that happened at the same time, ours was a General Assembly, theirs was a convention, and look and compare the two, okay? And this is not meant to be an offense to anyone at all, but just from at least my perspective. So here's my opinion piece, right? Maybe even my hot take. I'm looking at the two, and I'm way more encouraged by the PCA's General Assembly, okay? And one such thing, there were similar things talked about of, the nature of women in ministry, right?
Yep.
And fair, good, fine thing to talk about. But one of the things that I'm encouraged by with the PCA that if I were SBC, I would be fairly discouraged of, and Seth and I talked about this before, wasn't really planning on bringing it up, but here we are. One thing that the SBC did have to sit down and bring up and deliberate on was, do we as a group hold to the Nicene Creed, which got voted down, and I'm sure there are reasons for that. But one of the big differences between the Southern Baptist Convention and the PCA is everybody in the room at the PCA we have a very thoughtful, historic understanding on primary things. There is not a single person, a single pastor in the PCA who is going to quibble with the language of the Nicene Creed. It's already assumed. And so we're not having to have lengthy conversations on the Trinity or the nature of the church or the work of the Spirit in a variety of fashions. And so we're already able to enter into better conversations just because we already have our primary things so solidly down. I would be really discouraged if I belonged to a denomination and there are quibbles over, is the Nicene Creed an authoritative document for us? And for the denomination at the end of convention to, at the end of the day, say no, that would really bother me because it's a primary thing. And the PCA, again, this is just me. I'm a PCA pastor, so this is not meant to be offensive to anyone. But I think it's a mark of health, even if we ended up talking about things that I found strange at our General Assembly. Everybody in the room has already been through so many levels of, okay, but on the primary things, we're all so solidly together. That's the brothers in the trenches mentality that I think we need. And we already are all assuming so many of the same things. So then you can enter into good conversation. So I just wanted to say all of that to say there are a lot of marks of wonderful health within the PCA. There's that.
But then some weird things. Because people are weird. So break these. So you listed 4, and these are kind of the 4 that I was noticing. Because I tried to keep up with it a little bit.
Yeah.
And the first one you kind of already alluded to, but the use of officer titles and women in ministry. So break that out for me.
So one of the questions that's gotten brought up throughout, even in this is going to sound super duper weird to a lot of people, right? Because the PCA this is somewhat of a modern term, is a confessionally complementarian denomination, right? Which means we believe that men and women are made in the image of God, equal, but with different roles, particularly in the household and in church. Okay, I think that's a charitable complementarian definition. What that means, though, practically, is that especially in the PCA, we have women do all kinds of things in ministry and amazing things in ministry. I'm going to say this is going to sound really weird to people. In certain regards, we do have women in leadership in PCA churches. And here's what I mean. Ms. Terry Eves leads the charge in women's ministry. Okay. She's accountable to the session. That's true. But she's a leader in the church, in not an ordained way. Nobody laid hands on her and, sent her on. But like, she's a leader in the church. She teaches at the church. She teaches women at the church. But she teaches at the church, which is, authority. And, I think Paul in particular would be fine with Miss Terry Eves, specifically teaching women in the church the Bible. I think he would applaud that and say, yeah, that's beautiful. Good job. Great. Awesome. We don't ordain women, though, to the offices of the church of deacon and elder or pastor. Elder, pastor are, in our view, is the same office. So one of the big discussions, though, in the PCA recently is, can we give titles to people in the church who maybe are on staff, but aren't ordained, that sound ordained, more or less. So, like, for instance, I do know churches that, like, they'll have a distinction between pastor and minister. Mm-hmm. You can have a pastor, but then a children's minister. And a children's minister is not a pastor. That's what some people say. That's not in the PCA, right? That's mainly actually SBC churches. Yikes. So we don't do that by and large. One of the big kind of tension points, though, is the term deaconess, right? The two, we believe that there are two offices in the church in the PCA, elder and deacon. Deaconess is a female deacon. So there's some debate in the PCA of, is that allowable, right? And as a denomination, we have said from our inception that deaconess is not an actual office, right? It's fine to have women who serve in the church, and you should have women who serve in the church. But you're not laying on hands and distinguishing them as an officer of the church in the form of deacon. Okay. Believe it or not, there's actually, and one of the reasons why I think we're able to really enter into good discussion about this is one, we all have generally the same hermeneutic. We read the Bible the same way because we all ascribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And there is a history in the Reformed Church of churches having deaconesses. Calvin had deaconesses in Geneva. One of our forebears, who is certainly not somebody who was caught up in the culture wars or in a lot of things, was Ed Clowney, the first president of Westminster Theological Seminary, who served both in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, OPC, and the PCA. He viewed deaconesses as a viable office of the church. And again, Ed Clowney, ask anybody who knows him, it was by no means theologically liberal in the slightest way possible. Like, no way. As conservative as they get. So there's a precedent for it. So we have had an ongoing discussion about titles of officers in ministry, particularly pertaining to women. And what we reaffirmed this past time was only people who are ordained can have the title of an officer of elder or deacon. So, I gave you a little background on, there is a, somewhat of a precedent in the Reformed tradition of having deaconesses, right? And calling deaconesses that. So there are some people who say, we want deaconesses, so we would like to see that happen. That got pushed back. One of the big cruxes, though, of the argument, the largest group of Presbyterians in the world, you want to take a guess at where they're from?
Probably Africa.
South Korea.
Oh, okay.
The largest group of, so here in the South, if you bump into a Christian, you can typically assume they're Baptist,
Mhm.
right? In South Korea, which is a highly Christian culture now, highly densely Christian populated, in South Korea, not North Korea, South Korea. If you bump into a Christian there, you should just assume they're Presbyterian.
Mm.
And one of the biggest demographics, actually, in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, are actually Koreans. And so there's a huge number of Korean pastors in the PCA, many of which are first generation. There aren't nearly enough PCA churches that are Korean, but there are a number of different Korean-speaking PCA churches. In the Korean church, though, a sign of respect, you refer to older men as elder, or the Korean word for elder, and you refer to older women as deaconess or servant, which is, that's what the word means. The Korean church, in so many ways, is on the far conservative side of the PCA spectrum, which is as conservative theologically as it gets. And so one of the discussions was, okay, we don't want to rush this thing, and like basically tell a super faithful group of the PCA, hey, for our cultural reasons, and some of the debates about, egalitarianism and complementarianism, you can't kind of keep some of your cultural mandates, which is not about egalitarianism or complementarianism at all. It's a cultural thing in regards to respect. So some of the pushback for why we were even debating, and I think this is actually was a sign of health, not a weird thing, which we kind of started. So don't hear this as me being like, it's a weird thing that we were even discussing it. There were good and valid reasons for us to discuss this one in particular. Was to say, okay, with our Korean brothers and sisters, where this is a cultural thing, what are we doing there for them? Are we gonna shut them down, like, et cetera, et cetera? And so there's a lot of sympathy there for our Korean brothers and sisters to be like, okay, we get that you're not thumbing your nose at the denomination and saying we're gonna sneak egalitarianism into the back door. This is just a part of your culture, how you talk and speak and what you grew up with. But also while being sensitive to, okay, but we do have to have a general kind of understanding of what office is and who's qualified. And so that one was a little bit tedious. That was the weirdness, is it was tedious because it's like there are, in this case, good reasons not to say, you can't call anybody a deaconess, because again, they're not trying to sneak egalitarianism in the back door. So
Gotcha.
Tedious. Again, we still landed on the side of, unless you're ordained in that office of elder or deacon, you can't be called that. I could see that one coming back around and us giving a caveat to say, okay, Korean churches, right? We get you're not saying.
Yeah.
You're not saying.
So a lot of what the discussion was drawing the line between what is an officer and what is not an officer.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, that was a big distinction. So the second one was the question about what is preaching. And this is something that's happened in a variety of settings in churches in America, right? So one group got brought up on charges because they had a woman preach in the church. And one of the reasons why they had her preach is because they said, we didn't really think what she was doing was preaching. We, thought it was more of an exhortation, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that got brought up in our BCO, our Book of Church Order, which is a third tier authoritative source, it has a variety of things that we do take vows on, our playbook. One of the things that we have a part of it is on the nature of the sacraments. There's a chapter in a certain section in the BCO that they're not binding chapters. They're good guidelines, but they're not binding. One chapter on there that's a good guideline, but not binding, is the chapter on preaching. And so one of the things that got brought up in the overtures was we need to make that chapter on preaching binding. It ended up not passing. And one of the reasons it didn't pass, and it didn't pass by much, was because actually our Westminster Standards have definitions and very clear biblical precedents as to what preaching is. And if you'll remember, our Westminster Standards are actually a higher authority than our Book of Church Order. And so the reason why, at least in my understanding, the reason why it didn't get voted up to include that chapter in the Book of Church Order on preaching is because we actually already have something that tells us what preaching is, and it's a higher source of authority, the Westminster Standards. So there was that one. It was a long debate. It seemed some of it, was the slippery slope argument of, if we don't define what preaching is, then, who knows what's going to happen and who will be preaching by the end of it. And we all have the same theology. We all are playing by the same rule book. We actually have that already in place. So we really don't need this. So that's why that one didn't pass. Okay, so here's the one that was like the weirdest one.
This is the one that I think if people are paying attention to anything,
yes,
that this is probably the thing that has kind of like come across their feeds.
That's
so
right.
to speak.
That's right. This one came across. There was an overture, and various people have interpreted the overture in different ways. Here is my as unbiased presentation of the overture as I can give. There was an overture made to get together two arms of the PCA, our children's discipleship ministry arm, CDM for short, and our missions department or arm, MTW, Mission to the World, to get together and to write up a report on the influence of Sarah Young's Jesus calling. Is it pervasive in your two spheres? And is it harmful in your two spheres? Okay.
Specifically, so for people who don't know what Jesus calling is, Jesus calling is a devotional
That's right.
style book
written
by Sarah Young, who was a PCA church member.
That's right. Yeah.
Who passed pretty recently.
Yeah, September.
And the book is written as though it is Jesus speaking.
Right. Right.
And so a lot of the concern around this book, even like from the get-go, for the last 20 years since it was published,
right,
much of the concern has been, is this a violation of sola scriptura?
Yeah.
Is this a violation of the inerrancy and the infallibility of Scripture?
Right.
It is someone portraying themselves as Jesus or portraying things that Jesus said to her. The stories around it are varying, but loosely either paraphrasing, to be generous, paraphrasing Scripture in a way that portrays it as though Jesus were saying it,
right,
by totally rewriting it, or another version being that it's something that the author feels like Jesus wanted to say through her.
Right. Yes. So is this damaging or not? And again, Sarah Young was not only a member of the PCA, her husband is a PCA pastor and missionary, and he's still alive and was at GA when they brought this up. A lot of people felt like this was basically a heresy trial on the behalf of Sarah Young, who very recently just died.
And therefore could not express her positions.
That's right. Couldn't express her positions, etc. Also, pretty much everybody in that room, I don't think anybody in there has read Jesus Calling. Right? Because it's definitely outside the camp of the PCA. And some of the arguments that we heard is, this was a very influential book on my mom, and, it did a lot of damage. And so you should do it. That was some of the vote in favor of bringing this up. but some of the pushback is like, well, man, talk to your mom. Like, and so this was one that I just found bizarre of all the things to talk about. And again, this is me being transparent. This is purely my opinion. So don't let my opinion kind of color, and maybe I shouldn't even say my opinion, but I've already said it. So, don't let this color your judgment. I think it was well-intentioned to figure out how pervasive is it harmful or not? Okay. There's that. My general take is this is not the thing that most people in PCA pews are talking about, because most people in PCA pews are wigged out, candidly, by that sort of extra biblical type thing, right?
So what did they end up landing on? Because they ended up choosing not to erect like because original. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what my understanding was that originally they were pushing to form a brand new committee to investigate this, right. And so they landed on basically there are already 2 existing committees who kind of do this thing already.
Yes,
and charging them with looking at it.
That's right.
Is that correct?
Yes. So to a degree, they were going to form a brand new committee, and they said there are 2 arms of the PCA that are already doing this: our CDM, our discipleship ministry arm, and MTW, Mission to the World. Honestly, I think that's still a little bit random. I don't know anybody at CDM, so I can't speak on their behalf. That one makes a little bit of sense. I do know people at MTW, and I was actually sitting next to somebody from MTW who will let the innocent remain unnamed, but I looked at them and I was like, what are we doing? Are you like going to hit this up? I'm like, no, I don't know. So anyway, I just found it strange, and there did, like, of all the things that we could talk about, this is what we're bringing up. And I do think that there's a good place of saying we as a denomination should gather together and look at the things that are in our pews that people are reading, that people are dipping their toe in, and writing up and saying, is this pervasive and is it harmful? I don't, this is just my general take, but knowing the flock at Zion Presbyterian Church, not many people are reading Jesus Calling.
And I'll say as a member, so even less authority than you have, it seemed strange to me on 2 accounts that we were singling out Jesus Calling.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So the first account being that Sarah Young has passed.
Yeah.
And so number 1, she can't come in and answer any of these questions. Her husband, who's probably still grieving, is left to do that.
Yep.
And number 2, she was a member.
Right.
And so the time, I mean, I feel like the time to do this would have been 10 years ago.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like have her come in and go through this whole process with her a part of the process.
Yeah.
And so it feels strange to do it
now,
posthumously.
That's right.
Secondly, it feels weird to single out any book in particular and not say, okay, let's take a survey of what's kind of happening. Mm-hmm. Like you said, I think that there are plenty of things.
Yeah.
And maybe Jesus Calling is one of those things.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not. Maybe it's heaven is for real. Maybe it's not. Like there are all sorts of books because candidly, putting the name Christian on something sells it.
Yeah.
Like just straight up.
Yeah.
It sells something. If you put Christian on it, people will buy it.
Yeah.
And there's an industry, there's a Christian publishing industry whose job is ultimately to make money and sell things, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, right? Like they're thankfully someone asked Tim Keller to write a lot of books.
That's right.
So we have a lot of his works for us. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it does mean that there is a broad swath that is frequently unchecked in the world. And so it seems strange to me to just single out like this one book be like, what effect is this one book having when really it might be the 15 other books that are out there that may be more pervasive.
That's right.
Or so on.
That's right. And, just generally speaking, that sort of thing is not what most people in the PCA. That's not, to use a Gen Z term. That's just not our vibe.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Like there are lots of other big ticket items that people are actually that are damaging and harmful.
Mm-hmm.
That we could have brought up. That and that's Jesus calling is just, in my opinion, just not one of them. So it struck me as odd.
Yep.
And that was the weirdness of General Assembly on my regard. Also the kind of evenly split things on certain aspects being a little bit down the middle. 53-47 kind of percent cut was another weird thing. But in general, and this is my overall, here we go. General Assembly was good. I love the PCA. I dearly love my brothers. And I think the Lord is going to continue to use the PCA in the way that he has. I pray that we have a spirit of humility in a world that doesn't. And I think the Lord could really use that. So I hope he works that in our hearts, that we as a denomination would be unique. And so with that, we'll wait until next year and we'll do it all again.
Sounds great. If we will put a link in the show notes, so if you're curious about the different things and want to read all the more specific language, you can read all about that at By Faith magazine.
Yep.
And if you have questions about it, you can email keaton.paul@pcazion.org, and he's forgotten way more about all this stuff than I'll ever know. So he's the guy you want. Until next week.